Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Real Birding Podcast, the show where we break down the world of birding and talk about our own birding adventures. I'm Will Keller, coming to you from Charlotte, North Carolina.
And I'm Caleb Putnam in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Caleb, this week we are going to talk about bird decline and understanding bird decline in both a sort of broad and more specific sense. We'll get more into what that means. But first, let's cover last week's bird quiz. Last week, we played for you guys the audio of a rose-breasted grosbeak singing, and Tim Cornish yet again gets that right. Good job, Tim.
Nice, Tim. I hope that the other listeners out there are also feeling more confident in identifying their warblers, their small W warblers, as we alluded to a couple episodes ago.
That's right.
We'd slip that one in there under the radar.
Absolutely. This week, we are going to show you a photo of this tiny little duck as our bird quiz. And Caleb, do you want to explain a little bit of the backstory with this bird?
Absolutely. So this is an anonymous photo from Florida, where there was a family of ducklings crossing a very busy road in an open marsh area lacking trees. And this was recent. This was, I think, maybe within the last week. And the Good Samaritan was able to save the lives of all of these birds. But the key is, what is it? Because this is kind of unusual looking. And this is a really hard one for the record. This is our hardest quiz yet to date. So if anybody can get it, we'll have to give them some big old kudos.
Yeah. All right, send in those responses, put it in the comments, and if you get it right, you might get a shout out at the beginning of next week's episode. Without further ado, let's get into it. Well, Caleb, we swore we would keep it light, but some topics just have to be discussed, and this is it's a very sad topic.
No doubt about that. We love birds. We love wildlife. We love a vibrant planet where that you're living in a intact ecology. Just even knowing that the Amazon still exists, for example, right? Even if the average person, American or anybody else, never goes there, just knowing that we have wildernesses that are pumping out oxygen, that are just rich stores of biodiversity, it's calming. It makes us want to live. The earth is the type of place that we want to live in. And so I think anytime there's a degradation there, it hurts. I mean, it feels like the destruction of the Mona Lisa or something like this. You can see the Mona Lisa about to burn down, and you want to do everything in your power to help it. And so I think there's times where we do have to take a little bit closer look at why is it that there are problems, and try to make sure that we've got our heads wrapped around that and know ultimately what to do about it.
Yeah. And just to stay on the Amazon rainforest for a minute, we like to think of it as really far away, and at least we have this wilderness still there. But us in North America, we're actually deeply in tune with what's going on in the Amazon, because so many of our birds winter in the jungles of Central and South America, some of these beautiful habitats. But these populations that spend a lot of the year down there actually rely on North American habitat preservation and bird populations up here, because they actually breed up in this area.
Yeah. And Will, a lot of people think about that things like scarlet tanagers and rose-breasted grosbeaks are North American birds, or even U.S. or Canadian birds. The fact of the matter is, though, they spend more time in the tropics than they do up here. So this connectivity, we're lucky to have visitors from the tropics come up here for 4 months, and we're happy to get a third of the year with them. And in any event, it ties all of the habitats and all of the biomes of the planet together. So the whole boat either rises or sinks according to our action, as a global community, and getting the word out on these things. Because as you were alluding to before we started taping today, a lot of folks just don't know about these problems. And if they did know about it, they would take different actions. So that's really where I'm sitting. That's kind of the point of this conversation.
Yeah, I saw a statistic that the number one most shared value, or thought to be admirable value across the entire political spectrum, is how a person treats animals. Nobody likes to see somebody kicking a dog, and nobody likes to see someone being cruel to wild animals either. That is just something that is so deeply unpalatable to us as humans. And I think the big problem is, yeah, we have seen 1 in 4 birds gone since 1970. All of the data points to that. It's tantamount to ecological collapse. And I think birds are a representation of an even broader issue, which is ecological collapse.
Yeah.
But if people were aware of the ways in which we as humans are influencing some real cruelty that's happening out there, that's not intentional cruelty, but it's a byproduct of, I just think, ignorance.
Yeah.
So yeah,
it's not easy to know. You know, the information is in technical papers, and it doesn't easily get into media tidbits, easily digestible tidbits. So there does come a role for people maybe like us to kind of make it a little bit more accessible, and really pin it down to just nuggets that are easy to understand and easy to know what to do about.
Yeah.
We'll do our best here today. Let's see if we can do it.
Yeah, Caleb, can you start by laying out your bathtub analogy? I think it's such a good way to understand the sort of 2 different levels that we're thinking at here.
Yeah, I think there's this inherent thing when you see a bird get killed, or you learn of a bird dying. It's just inherently sad. You care about the life of that individual bird. What we need to distinguish here, though, is what we are talking about is the prevention of extinctions. So we're talking about populations. Well, the population means all of the individuals of a species. So say like American robins, there's 450 million of them across North America, according to the best estimates. With respect to populations like that of the American robin, we don't want that population to go down to 0. That's extinction. We want that to hold steady or even increase if we think it's too low and that it can come back higher. So that's what we mean when we say population conservation. There's 2 different issues on the plate to understanding the population dynamics, and to keep it super simple here. The amount of habitat that the bird has available to it is what we're going to refer to as the bathtub. That's the size of the bathtub. So for robins, they're generalist. They can be in forests. They can be in wetland. They're in every habitat type, mountaintops, grasslands. Their bathtub is gigantic. It can contain at least 500 million birds. But the amount of water that's in this bathtub is telling you whether the population is at the carrying capacity of the available habitat or not. And it will also tell you, is the population increasing or decreasing within the bathtub? And it's important to understand the different dynamic between those 2 options. A lot of folks will already know this, but Cornell Lab of Ornithology made a big landmark publication maybe about 5 years ago, talking about the loss of 3 billion birds across North America. Now, we're not technical experts in these papers. People will want to go read them for themselves. But in my analogy, I think that the 3 billion lost is a combination of a smaller bathtub for lots and lots of species, because we've either reduced the available habitat by cutting it down or modifying it, or maybe fragmenting it so that there's enough acres, but they're too salt and pepper across the landscape, and a certain species might need a big clump of it. So that's degradation, that's fragmentation. And then there's also degradation, where like an invasive species comes into the cattail marsh in like a Phragmites reed, and now it's just not. It's still marsh, but it's so degraded that it doesn't contain soras and king rails or whatever it is.
Or if the forest has been clear cut, maybe it'll grow back 30 years later. But if all the trees are 30 years old and there's no understory and there's no canopy, it's not going to be an area that super specialized species can use. And a lot of our migratory birds are highly specialized, which is why they're here instead of South America.
Right. So there's the reduction of the size of the bathtub is a really important contributor on the long-term scale, because you take like North American prairie, just as one example. It used to stretch from the Central Plains all the way to Long Island, New York, when we had heath hens, which was the eastern form of the greater prairie chicken, which is now long extinct since 1939. That subspecies is extinct. And we have totally reduced the amount of the bathtub down to, probably like a 20th of what it used to be. And the stuff that exists is more fragmented than it used to be. So that's why greater prairie chickens could go extinct in the next 100 years easily.
Caleb,
there's no bathtub left for them.
Additionally, even the prairie that still does exist is often overgrazed by cattle. And people talk about using cattle as a sort of analog for the buffaloes, whose population has also obviously crashed from what it was 150, 200 years ago. There's levels to the degradation, is what I'm trying to say. Even if we
Right.
do have prairie, it can still be a huge struggle for a lot of the birds that are trying to make a go of it there.
Right, right. And these, I'm just trying to draw a couple of like specific examples to kind of to illustrate the larger message there. But like in eastern forest, as you're referring to as cerulean warbler, this is a bird that its habitat requirement is large contiguous blocks of forest. Now, it doesn't have to be 100% forest. You can actually clear cut it down to about 70% forest and 30% of cuts, and they will still love it as long as the giant block of forest is, over whatever, 50 to 100 square mile area or larger, is still in 70% forest. So it's very formulaic, and those are specialist species which have the more tight requirements. Something like a robin, you can probably do whatever you want to do with it, unless you pave it over, and even then they'll probably still nest in the Norway maple. So this is a complicated topic. I don't mean to imply that it isn't. But on the whole, when they say that there's been a 3 billion bird decline, I think they're largely saying that the bathtub is much smaller if you average it out across all North American birds. And maybe they might also be taken into account the added mortality sources that are draining the water out of the bathtub. It probably has taken that into account as well. So maybe it's a combination of both.
Well, when you hear a statistic like feral cats kill almost 2 billion birds every single year, that has to be a water issue and not a bathtub issue, I would think.
Exactly. Yeah, right. And then when that happens, you end up with unoccupied habitat, right? So the bathtub is still big enough, but the water is like half drained out in the analogy there. And so
Yeah.
why don't we actually go through the water, the specific examples of water coming out of the tub?
And by the way, I want to just point out that I think water issues are issues that we, without making some huge societal change, these are issues that we could actually probably come close to solving just by adopting some very simple practices. And it might be industry-wide change, but I don't see us, restoring, hectares upon hectares of agricultural land back to areas where heath hen could roam. But there are things that we could do that could just take the pressure off and put some water back in that bathtub. So yeah, let's go through the list there.
Absolutely. These pressures are very species specific. To get into a proper analysis, you'd have to talk one species at a time and get into the weeds with it, because the antidote for each species can be a little bit different. And in some cases very, very different. But we're just trying to tell the big picture story here. So let's start with the big ones. The number one mortality source across North America, this includes Canada and the United States, is cats. And that's 2.6 billion with a B now. So 2.6 thousand million. There's a lot of birds annually. Buildings collisions at number 2 is 625 million. 342 million is coming from low-rise buildings versus 275 million from residences. Those numbers are actually pretty close. Your private residences kill a lot of birds, and everybody knows why, because everybody has had a bird hit their window. We know what this is coming from.
Right.
Where are these estimates coming from? Before I finish it, is a study that was done by Scott Loss and Pete Mara and a bunch of other colleagues, maybe about 10 years ago, where there was the first data-driven look at getting actual estimates from data of in terms of what's draining water out of the tub. So this is actually from studies. There's error bars. I'm just giving you the middle of the estimate. Automobile collisions comes in at 212 million birds. Power line collisions at 48 million. Wind turbines at 588 million. You kind of start to see the picture as we go through here. It's death by 1,000 paper cuts. The water is slowly draining out. It's not chopping the head off the animal. It's 1,000 paper cuts that slowly drains it loose. And then you end up, and the problem there is you end up not having as clear cut of a solution, because you have to solve multiple paper cuts, if not most of the paper cuts, all at the same time, and all of them are very difficult issues to actually solve. Pesticides, 2.7 million, marine gill nets, 20,000. And this brings up another point of contention. Well, if it's only 20,000, that's no big deal, right? False. Because if a marine gill net, I don't know if everybody knows what these are, but the commercial fishers that go out into international waters and drop gigantic nets, and it's catching all kinds of stuff, turtles and marine mammals. Problem is, albatrosses and petrels, these birds that survive, in some cases 70 to 80 years and are producing a chick up all the way up until age 80 or 75. If you kill that albatross when it's 5 years old, that's now 65 years worth of chicks that are not going to get born, and they can only do one a year. So the population cannot withstand taking the adults out of the population like that. So 20,000 albatrosses is a huge conservation problem. It's a small number, but it's a huge problem.
Especially considering the nest predation a lot of these seabirds encounter on their breeding grounds, which are usually isolated islands that are infested with rats and mongoose and all these nest predators. So,
and in those cases, that's correct. But it's the good part there is they know we've perfected how to go into an island and completely remove the rats, so that these seabirds, you have to drop poison blocks in a grid pattern throughout the entire island. So if it's a giant enough island, it's hard to do it, but they've absolutely mastered this stuff. So they know exactly how to drop the poison blocks in a grid pattern that is tight enough that eventually all the rats end up being killed off. And again, these are islands that did not have rats. We brought them there. We brought it's usually cats or rats or
mongoose, whatever that is.
Yeah, mongooses is one. Stuff like that. Once those things get there, these sitting baby seabirds are just completely vulnerable because they just sit there while the adults are out at sea trying to collect fish and food for them, and they just literally gnaw at the babies when they're in the burrows. So anyway,
this actually gets in on a point that I really like. Some people, when they're thinking about bird habitat decline, it's like, well, what are we supposed to do? It's hard to understand what humans could be doing that could cause such a huge difference. We just have to realize it is not the universal default for there to be 8 billion humans on the earth that all require resources, especially people in Western society, which require a lot more resources than people in other parts of the world. And I don't say require like there's something inherent about us requiring more. We just consume more. My point being, native ecosystems have been evolving for a minimum of 10 to 15,000 years as glaciers receded in North America, and in some cases more like hundreds of thousands of years, or even millions of years in places like southern Appalachia, which is where the highest salamander diversity in the world is.
Yeah.
I just want to make the point that we are trying to figure out a way to reconcile human civilization in the way that we see it today, which it's only been like this for a few hundred years, and maintaining the beauty of the world, which is the sort of local ecology of the 10,000 species of birds that also inhabit this planet. I just wanted to cover that really quickly because I think it's it's really hard for people to grasp just how different the world is for most wildlife than it would have been for the entirety of that lineage of natural history. Sorry, that's very wordy, but it's important.
No. And actually, I want to throw in a couple more anecdotes as well. I'm in my 40s. I know birders that are much older than me, and some of them have already passed on, but people who are from the olden days are arguably, but it's not even that long ago. I know people who are alive right now that were birding in the 60s, and it was a different scene because when you had a warbler fallout back then, you would get days with hundreds and hundreds of individuals of every species. I hear stories about people walking around Whitefish Point on a fallout day, and there being thousands of white-crowned sparrows just carpeting the grass everywhere you walk. You're just kicking hundreds and hundreds of them up everywhere you walk. Those events do not happen anymore. And it's anecdotal, but it reinforces the broader pattern. And another one is mortality at communications towers, which we should definitely touch on briefly. Birds that are migrating at night are utilizing the stars and the moon as orientation and navigation assistance. And when you put up a tall tower with a light on the top of it, the birds will fly into that light and circle it, and they'll either fly into the light or they'll hit a guy wire that's holding the tower up. And this phenomenon in the 60s and 70s at one tower in Wisconsin was killing as many as 30,000 birds in one night. So the people who were studying this would walk the grounds under this tower in the 1950s and 60s, and I think even up into the 70s. You would get many nights where there was 20,000, 30,000 dead birds, all migrant birds from the tropics, in one night. And that, it doesn't happen anymore, Will. There's two ways you can interpret that. One is there's just not enough birds left to kill, and that's certainly a contributor. Somebody would have to tease that apart with a new study. The second part is, did the birds start avoiding the lights? Did they start to evolve behaviors that would make them better at avoiding collision deaths and nocturnal lit structures in the night sky?
Yeah.
In any event, these patterns are real. So when we say 3 billion birds lost, it's we're not guessing. It's something like that, and we really do need to turn it around.
I do want to take your analogy about the structures there to the next level, which is, if the birds did evolve a tendency to avoid these lights, we have to remember the reason why they were attracted to the lights in the first place is because they were disoriented by it, because of they use the night sky, they're sensitive to light, they use this for migration. So if they are less attracted to these structures, would that mean that they've now suffered in their ability to navigate, which would make it even harder for them to then find suitable breeding grounds, or harder for them to make it back down to their wintering grounds? I'm just saying there's trade-offs with these things. So even if there is a good case, there's a reason for every single characteristic a bird has.
Yeah, I mean, these are all great questions. The reason that we have to put lights on the towers is so that aircraft don't hit them. So, we've got to do something, and we still do. But, as we start to build the conversation toward solutions, let's talk about that example. I actually have a really nice point of contact with this one. Dr. Joel Gehring of Central Michigan University pioneered the first study of trying to get actual estimates on what types of lights on the towers, the presence and absence of the guy wires that support them, and then just the raw height of the tower. Nobody had statistically tested this to see what makes a tower kill more birds, and she did it. And that study began, I think, around 2012, 2015, and I was involved as one of the field technicians walking under a tower not far from Grand Rapids here. You just walk it every morning throughout migration, and she crunches the numbers. What she was able to do for the first time is to determine that a white strobe light, which goes on but then is off for 80% of the time, and then so it goes on and then off, on, off, kills way less birds than if you have a red, brightly lit one that kind of comes down, but before it turns off, it goes all the way back up again. So it's basically on the whole time. That is really bad for the birds. The strobe allows them to kind of clear out. And the other one's common sense. More guy wires equals more dead birds, and taller towers equals more dead birds. So once she determined those three things and published this, the federal agencies that regulate this stuff immediately updated their policies so that all newly built towers have to use the proper lighting systems. And I think
And what was the motivation for the federal agencies to regulate that these practices get changed? It's the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. This actually dovetails pretty well into, we wanted to cover this, and it's always a little bit touchy.
First of all, what is the Migratory Bird Treaty Act? I don't think a lot of people know.
Yeah, so this is comprehensive legislation that came about in I think either the 19 teens or the 1920s. It's a federal law that prevents the take of wild birds, with the exception of game birds. Take meaning you can't take wild birds out of the wild and keep them as pets. You can't shoot birds. You can't kill birds. You can't remove bird nests. You can't collect feathers. It's basically this amazing law that, we really put our money where our mouth was in terms of this American conservation ethic, the sort of John Muir, John James Audubon legacy. Whatever you think of those guys, it's hard to argue their legacy in North American conservation. And unfortunately, there's been some talk lately of this Migratory Bird Treaty Act being sunsetted. And you look at all this work that we've done, like, oh my gosh, we stopped killing birds and look, the birds come back. This happened with waterfowl. This Migratory Bird Treaty Act has been the North Star guiding almost all of the legislation that has been put in place to protect birds for the last 100 years. And it might be about to sunset out at potentially the most critical point for the vast majority of the birds that we're concerned about.
Tower owners are not allowed to kill birds. It's against MBTA. That's the point. But the problem is when you kill a bird accidentally, you won't get prosecuted. As long as you can say, well, we didn't mean to do it, typically the U.S. government is not going to prosecute you because it's not, there's reasons. It's just not politically viable. The politicians will breathe down their necks if they try to do this, so they won't do it. So then you have, if you're going to do something about it, you have to protect it another way. And that's why Joelle's study was so valuable. You know, it provided the data that said this policy will simply mostly fix the problem. Not entirely. There's still going to be birds dying, but way less. So that was a really neat study. And
absolutely.
Let's go to what people can and should do about this, Will, because this is genuinely hard to know that you're doing the right thing, or that, I mean, is it even possible do we even know what needs to be done to fix some of these water draining variables that we brought up? So for me, it starts with local action. What can you do in your yard that will address some of these issues? And I think the obvious one is cats. Keep the cat indoors. If neighbors have them, or if there's a feral cat colony, take action to educate people and to get those numbers of cats down and get them out of those habitats. Building collisions, local lights out campaigns, anything you can do to get tall lit structures like skyscrapers to turn the lights off at night during the migration period. There's efforts across the world in this regard, but they've made really good strides. They're not done yet, but they've made good strides.
2 falls ago, I think it was October 4th or 5th, there was an event, a fallout of warblers along the southern Lake Michigan lakeshore. And unfortunately, over, I think, 1,200 birds crashed into McCormick Place, which was a building near the Lake Michigan lakefront in Chicago. And some of these images were just terrible. Here, I'll just show this one really quick. So you look at some of these images and the press is terrible. It's not good for the birds. It's not good for the business. So after this, within about a year, McCormick Place added bird safe glass. They replaced all their glass, or maybe they put a film over the glass, and they saw over a 90% reduction in bird mortality caused by window collisions on their property. So that's basically the entire problem gone right there. An actionable step that this group could do.
The solution in most cases is actually, unlike in a lot of these, it actually is quite simple. If you just shut the lights off at night, the birds will not fly into the light bulb and then end up hitting the glass or the tower or the light itself. They'll just keep flying straight through like they have been for millennia prior to humans showing up and doing that.
And that's for nighttime collisions, and then daytime collisions can be prevented using things like stickers and less reflective bird safe glass. Okay. Another thing you can do at a local level is by getting rid of lawn and replacing it with native plants and native gardening, which is something that I'm personally passionate about because I like the plants in addition to the birds. But even if you're just more into the bird side of things, you can't help but look at your lawn as something other than detracting from what could otherwise be bird habitat. And it could be producing food for birds, whether it be berries and fruit or seeds or even larvae for young nesting birds. So there's lots of ways that you can turn literally your property, or maybe your kid goes to a school that really wants a pollinator garden. And it's like, well, let's make that pollinator garden maybe 4 times as big as you initially wanted to. Talk to people, talk to friends about making their gardens bigger, offer to put in a native garden for a friend. These are things that I've done for the last few years. And there's not many things that are more enriching than knowing that you are literally ripping out something that is an overall sink for bird populations and making it something that fills up bird populations.
And it's for pollinators, and it's, and it works. I do this too, Will. And you put in habitat in the backyard, migrant birds will use it. Even when you're in really bad habitat areas, like very urbanized areas, you'll still pull in mourning warblers in the back shrubs and stuff. So that's a great one. I love that one. What are we going to do as a society about wind turbines? As another example, There are times where what you need better laws. So you need to have public support so that the politicians at whatever level the law is needed they have the political capital to make the correct decisions, to make data informed decisions that can work within the system to not degrade what the economy that's going on, while also protecting what we need to protect. And that's so how do folks do that? The first step is they need to be informed about what the issue is, and then they need to get large numbers of people to let their political representatives understand that this is an important issue to them. They have to build a groundswell of public support for it, and then those politicians, and only then, will they be willing to spend the capital to vote, or they can vote for a certain policy and not have to spend any capital because the constituency really wants it. Power line collisions and automobile collisions, these are tough ones. These are really hard because how are you going to get birds to stop flying low to the road? The power line collision one, there has been quite a bit of ability to put markers on the lines in key habitats where birds tend to be colliding a lot, like near wetlands and water bodies. Some of that's common sense, and most of those developers want to do the right thing. I have personal experience on this. They want to do the right thing. That nobody wants to be hurting bird populations, but it can require the motivation of knowing that the state or federal government is going to come down on you if you don't do it right. And so, that's the same thing for wind turbines. The feds do not have requirements; they just have a voluntary set of recommendations that they do, and the developers work with them on that voluntarily because it's better when everybody sits at the table and works together. Always places for improvement, though, right? And so just we as a constituency of birders and conservationists, we need to understand these issues and talk about it to everybody until there's a groundswell of public support for all the right policies.
And realizing that there's more than one way to help bird populations, even in a broad sense. There's this sort of granular preventing bird deaths and also making that bathtub bigger, protecting habitat, restoring habitat, supporting things like land conservancies is a great way to do this locally. Yeah. But in a broad sense, just like, using your vote really wisely and understanding people's policies on clear cutting forests that are virgin forests. These are things that can't happen if we want to make that bathtub bigger.
Yeah. So this is really good to close the loop. We want to make the bathtub as big as we can for each of the important species, and we also want to fill the tub up with water. And those are two different things. And I think the one thing we maybe haven't talked about is that in certain examples, there are specialist species that have such unique requirements or such low population sizes that the only way to save it is to do a project digging into the weeds with that bird and giving it whatever it needs to keep it alive. So things like Puerto Rican parrot, was it down to like a couple dozen individuals in Puerto Rico, only place in the world is found. Well, they've got it up to hundreds now, and they've figured out what was the problem. Kirtland's warbler in Michigan was down to 167 pairs in like 1987. All the individuals in the world would fit on one little dinner table if you had them all in the same spot. And we figured out that it was cowbirds that were laying eggs in their nests and the loss of fire, which was not producing the young, even-aged pine stands that they nest in Michigan. And that got fixed by the feds and the state government. And now they're coming back up. And they even took it off the endangered species list. And that's the tip of the iceberg. There's countless examples of this. In those cases, I would say the public just needs to be aware of it and be very supportive of it in any possible way, especially letting the politicians know that they really want those projects to continue. And I have to draw one other really important example. Hawaii right now has multiple species that are on the brink of extinction, and one, the akikiki, probably just went extinct in the wild, maybe even in the last month or so. We don't know exactly when it gets down to, but it's down to like just a couple, 3-5 birds in the wild. With the mosquito problems that they're having on Kauai, the mosquitoes have reached the top of the mountain. soon as the bird gets bit, but it gets avian malaria and passes away. So it's not it's not necessarily a straight habitat issue. It's getting rid of the mosquitoes because they're not native to Hawaii. We brought them there. So,
Right.
That project in particular is being shut down with the cuts that are currently happening to, I think it's the USGS research lab that's in control of the remaining individuals in captivity. And if those birds aren't kept alive until the mosquitoes are controlled, then Akikiki has no chance. And it's going extinct right under our noses, and very few people know about it. So it is important, to know these and then get the word out.
Yeah. Well, Caleb, I think we should wrap it up. We're going longer than usual. Any final message here?
Well, it's been a little bit less, upbeat of an episode, but I think it's important to have these conversations because why are we here? We care about birds. We care about biodiversity in general. It's not just about birds. Birds are just kind of the flashy indicator one. We care about all of living organisms, and I think it's complicated, but there's also some really easy to understand guidelines about how to approach these topics so that we can not have to feel hopeless about them. We want to have hope, and we do know what many of the solutions are. We do. Now it's just an issue of getting everybody on board and really building up the motivation and building up the positivity that we can all contribute to this and make a difference. And that's what we're doing.
Amen. Thanks, everybody, for tuning into this week's episode of the Real Birding Podcast. If you think somebody could benefit from learning the information laid out in this episode, please share it. It's the reason why we do what we do. We're here to save birds. We're here to help people enjoy birds. Please like, share, and subscribe so we can help spread the word some more. Otherwise, peace out.
Peace out.